At Pan M360, I am with Amahl Arulanandam, who is a soloist, also band leader, also explorer in contemporary music, and involved with the Thin Edge New Music Collective. The Tin Music Collective will be matched with the ensemble called Paramirabo in Montreal on the Conservatoire de Montréal on November 29th. Hi, Amal.
Hello, how are you?
Good about yourself?
I'm doing well. Very well, thank you.
Excellent. So, Amal, this is a sort of a teamwork between two ensembles, and you're going to perform music from Julius Eastman, Louis Andriessen, Yaz Lancaster, Nicole Lizée, and James O'Callaghan. So let me, or let us, for Pan N360 users, understand this reunion between two ensembles and how has been selected the repertoire for this program.
Yeah, so I think the initial partnership between the two started between the three ensemble leaders, Cheryl Duvall and Ilana Waniak from Thin Edge. They're the founders and artistic directors, and Jeff Stonehouse from Ensemble Paramirabo. They all went to school together at Wilfrid Laurier University. And then when Jeff, I guess, relocated to Montreal, and Cheryl and Alana were in the Greater Toronto area, they both had formed these collective ensembles, and because they were such good friends through school, they decided to partner up, and they did a tour before I joined the ensemble back in, I think, I want to say 2016, 2015, 2016, that they called Raging Against the Machine. That was a double sextet album, and it was all works that were, I guess, um, political resistance pieces. So they actually recorded an album together called Raging Against the Machine that you can find on streaming services.
Yeah.
And then I joined with them in 2018 when we did the second iteration of that tour. And that was my first time working with Thin Edge and my first time working alongside with Ensemble Paramirabo. And it was called Raging Against the Machine 2. And initially that was supposed to feature a piece that is going to feature on this concert coming up. This will be the third iteration of the partnership. And will feature, so we did the world premiere in Toronto, but it'll feature the Quebec premiere of a new piece by Nicole Lizée called Chamberdestroy.
Hmm. Now, if we can be more specific about the pieces that will be performed,
Mm-hmm.
Nicole Lizée, we know her very well. We admire her work because this is the ultimate mastery in mashups,
Mm-hmm.
for example. But we also know Louis Andriessen from Holland, who've been performed many times by Société Musique Contemporaine du Québec previously. And maybe we can talk about those pieces, the challenges of those pieces, and what is interesting for you.
Mm-hmm. So, in terms of the Andreessen, that was actually performed on the first Raging Against the Machine tour. Again, I mentioned that they were all pieces that had to do with political resistance or something of that nature, and is on the album that they recorded. And so it was, I think, programming it for these concerts was kind of a callback to that initial joining up, and it feels very fitting, I guess, given the current political climate.
Yeah,
Um, yeah.
of course. Right
Yeah,
now, it's totally relevant.
yeah, and I mean, in terms of challenges with that piece, I mean, there's so many subtle shifts in rhythm and articulation that I guess become difficult to coordinate between the two ensembles, because it very much is separated into two groups that are working together in some ways and are kind of resisting against each other in other ways. And also just the endurance of getting through the whole work, because it's very loud and it's just a lot of constant playing, very
Mhm.
machine like. It feels very much like being a cog in the wheel, a cog in the machine, and you're kind of trying to fight against it, but not really able to break out of
Yeah.
the box that you've been set in, which I think is very much the point of the piece. And the Lizée is a brand new piece. I've had the pleasure to work with Nikki a few times and have things that she's written with us in mind. And this piece takes a lot of influence from retro video games, and and so you'll even see two of the performers at some point in the piece playing a retro video game at the front of the stage. There'll be there's almost like a theatrical element to it. There's some staging where these cardboard TVs that look like old CRT tube TVs that the percussionists are going to be playing. And in the electronics track, there are a lot of samples that are callbacks to retro video games, which I guess is something that a lot of us are familiar with. A lot of us grew up with things like Space Invaders and Super Mario Brothers, all that kind of stuff. And it really has that. There's always kind of a quirkiness to a lot of Nikki's music, and I think it really captures that very, very well, especially in some of the sounds from like the bowed cardboard TVs. And there'll be some interesting things that happen with Lego instruments and foil / cardboard instruments that have been made, and it's almost like a child throwing a tantrum when they've lost the game in certain aspects. And it's kind of a nice. It's intense, but it's lighthearted as well, so it's a nice contrast to the Andriessen. In terms of James O'Callaghan, obviously he lived in Montreal for quite a while and was doing a lot there, and now he's relocated to Berlin. He actually had written a piece for the second Raging Against the Machine tour, which was the first thing I did with Thin Edge. And I think, again, this was kind of a callback to that tour where we're doing things that are new but also familiar, and just really embracing this partnership that all of these different elements had built together. And so James always writes really interesting music with field recordings and electronics, and he likes to cater his pieces very specifically to the people that he's working with. And I think you'll find that in this work. We haven't had a chance to sit down and work on it together yet. So the first time we'll hear it together will be when we get into the rehearsals at the beginning of next week. But it'll be interesting to hear how it all comes together.
There's a feel of Raging Against the Machine again in this next program. It's a sort of continuation. It's not necessarily the main topic, but it's there.
I think so. I mean, a lot of people, and they tend not to be artists, although some of them are, always rave about keep politics out of music, keep politics out of music. I don't think that's possible. Art and politics have been inextricably linked forever. And no matter what, when someone is writing music, there'll always be something that is relevant to the social climate of the time that they're writing in. Even with like Boulez and all those people back then, they were trying to write music that was devoid of the human element, but that was a response to
the Second World War.
Yeah, and so that's still influenced by politics and
of course.
Yeah, so even there's no way of getting around it. So everything, it's always a statement. And I know for people like Ilana and Cheryl, when they're programming things, they are very much keeping in mind addressing the climate of today and addressing social and political concerns. And that's something that Thin Edge and Paramirabo, I think, take very seriously when they're programming, picking composers, picking artists to commission, to work with. And I think that like, you're right, that is present here in this program too.
Yeah. And if we talk about the Julius Eastman music.
Yeah, so the Eastman Joy Boy, it was really interesting. It's really just, the score is very interesting. It's just single notes, really. And the performers are left to come up with their own arrangement, their own interpretation of the music. But I always found Eastman such an interesting figure because of kind of his place in that whole minimalist movement, where he was there at the same time as people like Steve Reich and Philip Glass and all that, but was working very much not in those circles and in kind of a lot of DIY circles and improvised music, but also not feeling necessarily at home there. And there's this really unbridled energy, and you can feel, um, even though the ensemble is doing their own arrangement of the piece, you can kind of feel this energy just wanting to burst out, and I'm not really sure how to describe it verbally, but there's just something there in the way Eastman writes, even though it's also minimalist music in the same vein. It feels like there's so much more raw energy, and just a vulnerability almost, and just because
Mhm.
he just would bare his soul in all
Mhm.
of the music that he would write. And you can see that in the titles that he gave a lot of his work. His identity was very, very important to him, as you could see in the titles again, and just I think he never really found that while he was alive. And
Mhm.
I think that resonates with a lot of us. Like, we're always trying to find people where we fit.
Yeah,
And
the quest at the end is not necessarily a clue.
yeah, I mean, it's kind of up to us to figure out what that means to us.
Yeah.
But it's Joy Boy is kind of a really beautiful piece in that sense, because since the interpretation is so open to the ensemble, I mean, there are recordings of it from groups that had worked with Eastman, I guess, but um, it is almost in a way like we're discovering our own identity, our own path through the interpretation of this piece.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yes, and we didn't talk about Yaz Lancaster. So,
Yeah, so Yaz is a great composer and sound artist and multidisciplinary artist. And I've met Yaz a couple of times, most recently when they came to Toronto for the premiere of this work. And um, it's a really beautifully textured. Again, there's like a sense of minimalism to it, but then there's also video projections that go along with that. And Yaz's work seems to take influence from all sorts of different pockets of music outside of Western classical music, of course. Like, it's notated in typical Western classical form, but I think what we're finding with Yaz's music, and with a lot of really interesting music that's being written now, you can't really call it classical music anymore, because
no.
there's so many influences from electronic music, from ambient music, from synth, all sorts of things. Like, it all kind of comes together in this really
Yeah, we
beautiful
can say
space.
that classical music now is not a question of European tradition now, which is
No,
not a
it's
bad news.
no, which is it's really beautiful to see and hear that. And um yeah, Yaz's piece was definitely a great addition. And there's some really interesting sound worlds that develop between the two ensembles, when they come together, and kind of sometimes split apart tonally and texturally, and just, yeah, it's this beautiful kind of wash of sound
Yeah.
that was the experience that I had when we played it last time, anyway.
Is it a rearrangement? How do you work? Two ensembles playing this program. How did you manage the arrangements for this gathering?
So we would do our own set of rehearsals with our own group prior to meeting, and then it's hard enough coordinating two people, let alone 12 people, right? So I guess dates, we it must have been a scheduling nightmare for Jeff, Ilana, and Cheryl to just find dates that worked for all 12 people. And actually, even on this tour, unfortunately, our original clarinet player couldn't join us. So we have someone else coming in, that we worked with before, to help out with the show in Montreal. What we end up doing is rehearsing on our own, and then we were able to find a week, I think, in February of last year, where Paramirabo came to Toronto, and we worked there. And then a few days before the show that we did in
Mhm.
May, And then this time around, Thin Edge is meeting a few times this week. Right now it's the 18th. And then we're heading to Montreal on the 26th, and we start rehearsals that evening and pretty much have full days of rehearsals up until the show on the 29th.
Is Thin Edge a new music collective hiring always the same personnel, or it changes?
So there's a core group of members. So it's not an ad hoc collective. But there are multiple people on each instrument on the roster of Thin Edge. In the event that one of us is unavailable, there's someone else that they're able to call on. And they also we also like to vary personnel just so it's not always the same people playing. But we do have a core group, and I find that that's it's better in a way because we all know how each other function. And so when it comes to working, well, there's fireworks behind me for some reason. What was that? We all know how we function,
Well, you know,
and I don't know what that was.
no explanation. Divine.
Yeah. But yeah, we all know how we function, and we're able to work together more easily that way, I guess. And in terms of playing together, like the actual act of chamber music, it's easier if you're familiar with each other. Like it's always a bit harder with ad hoc groups that are just coming together once for a few days of rehearsal and a show, and then the product is usually good because you have good players, but it's not as there's something missing because that trust isn't necessarily there.
Yeah, sure. So it's very important to have a core group, and then you can just replace some members and keep the sound, and the nucleus is always cohesive.
Yes, exactly. I fully agree with that. And I think in the end you end up with a more refined product, a more interesting product, and like I said, there's kind of an intangible that you end up having in the performance when people are familiar with each other and when that trust is there.
Amahl Arulanandam from 10 Edge New Music Collective. You're a soloist, and you were talking about this very interesting concert that will happen on November 29th at the Conservatoire de Musique de Montréal. I thank you very much for this, Amahl.
Thank you very much.
Welcome back to Montreal.
Looking forward to it.